Following on from last week's story, after Jesus had fed the 5,000 people, he withdrew to a quiet place alone, and the disciples chose to go back to Capernaum on their own in their boat. This is John chapter 6, reading verses 16 to 24. Jesus walks on the water. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. The strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I. Don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. The next day, the crowd that had stayed on the opposite shore of the lake realized that only one boat had been there, and that Jesus had not entered into it with his disciples, but that they had gone away alone. Then some boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the people had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. Once the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boats and went to Capernaum in search of Jesus. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jean. And now Simon Bennet is going to come to speak to us about that passage. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, Adam. Morning, everybody.
Morning.
Morning. Right. So, yes, this is, I believe, the 5th of the 7 signs we're looking at in the series. It's been a really great series to listen to, and really enjoyed preparing this sermon. And first thing I want to say is that actually in this passage there are 2 miracles. I don't know if anyone's aware of this, but there are 2 miracles. The first involves Jesus walking on the water. The second happens when Jesus climbs into the boat with the disciples, and that's in verse 21. So I just want to start with the first and best known miracle, Jesus walking on the water. The background to this miracle is that it follows directly from the feeding of the 5,000. And if you remember, the young people did a fantastic job last week of bringing that to us. And after the feeding of the 5,000, John tells us that Jesus withdrew from the crowds because it says the people wanted to make him their king. Okay. So Jesus withdraws from the crowds. The disciples, meanwhile, go down to the lake, get into a rowing boat, and they set off for Capernaum on the opposite shore. While they're rowing, they get 3 miles plus across the sea when a storm gets up and the water gets choppy. What's more, they then see Jesus approaching their boat, walking on the water. Now, how we interpret the miracles of Jesus, not just this one, but all of them in the series and the ones in other Gospels, how we interpret the miracles of Jesus is very important. Because these miracles or signs help to define how we see Jesus. People at the time when Jesus was on earth were asking the question, who is this man? And today, now in the 21st century, people are still asking that same question, and people still come up with different answers. Now, most people, even today, see Jesus positively. Even non-Christians see Jesus in a positive light because they like the sentiments behind his teaching. Okay? So, for example, stories like the Good Samaritan, something like that appeals to our better nature, helping those who are in need. And also, Jesus' teaching, do unto others as you would want them to do to you, is known as the golden rule. So in Jesus' day, people loved his teaching. They addressed him as good teacher, rabbi, And still today, people are inspired by the teachings of Jesus, and so they think of him as a good teacher, or maybe a spiritual guide or some kind of guru. But when you come to a passage like this in the Bible, then you see, in fact, that there is much, much more to who Jesus was. And you come across the conflict that people face when they want to pigeonhole Jesus as being just a good teacher. If that's the case, how then do you explain the miracles? Well, people do try. So, for example, last week, when we looked at the feeding of the 5,000, some will explain that Jesus actually fed the people spiritually. They were so enamored to be in the presence of this man, to receive this teaching. They were so in awe of him that they forgot their hunger. So Jesus was feeding them spiritual food, and that was enough. Just pure spiritual food. There was no physical food given to them. Others claim maybe some in the crowd did actually have food. Some did, some didn't. And what Jesus was doing was sharing these 5 loaves and 2 fish. Jesus wasn't performing a miracle, but he was demonstrating a principle. Share what you have with those who have nothing. So the feeding of the 5,000 was like a bring and share supper. However, the passage today presents a problem to those views. Jesus walks on water. How do you explain that? How do you remove the miraculous from that? Well, some have tried. One writer thought that the wind, the waves, the darkness combined to confuse the disciples. They saw this man maybe on the shore, but with the wind and the waves and everything going on, it looked like he was walking on water. It was a kind of optical illusion. But if you read the account in John's Gospel, Jesus walks right up to the boat. You don't just see him in the distance. He's not some distant ghostly figure. That he walks right up to the boat. Another idea is that maybe Jesus was walking on a sandbar just below the surface of the water. There was this sandbar. For 3 miles, the sandbar for 3 miles, and it just happened to run to where the disciples were. Seriously? So, excuse the pun, but I don't think either of those explanations hold much water. Yeah, I did say in advance, excuse the pun. Right. Look at the reaction of the disciples. They are in no doubt what they're witnessing. They're afraid, they're terrified. If they weren't sure, they'd be curious. They'd be like, well, it looks almost like that guy's walking on water. They're not curious. They're terrified, they're afraid. They know what they're witnessing. They're witnessing a miracle. They're witnessing a man walking across the sea. So this miracle cannot be easily explained away. Therefore, I believe we're left with 2 choices. Either it happened or it didn't. Okay? It's either fact or fiction. It's either truth or myth. And if it is true, then it points to Jesus being way, way more than just a good teacher. You put this miracle together with the others we've looked at in John's Gospel, and we see a man who feeds the hungry, heals the sick, turns water into wine. Then you carry on through the Gospel, and you come to the death and resurrection of Jesus, the ultimate miracle. And so you ask again, who was Jesus? Who was this man? He is way, way more than a teacher, a guru, or even a prophet. C.S. Lewis puts it like this. When he's talking about Jesus, you must make a choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up as a fool. You can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher, he has not left that option open to us. He did not intend to. And this miracle that we look at this morning backs up what C.S. Lewis writes. Either it's true and Jesus has power over nature and he's divine, or it's false and he's a fraud. Okay, but what if we believe the gospel account is true? What if Jesus did walk on water? What if he's divine? What then? Now, the sign we're looking at today is different from the others in the series. No one is healed. No cripple can walk. No blind man can see. No one is raised from the dead. No one is fed. No one's wine glass is refilled. Jesus walks on water. That's it. He starts off from one side of the Sea of Galilee and heads to the opposite, where the disciples are going. And instead of traveling all the way around the shore, he goes straight across. Jesus walks straight across, takes a shortcut, walks on water. Well, good for him. But what does that mean for us? So this is when we come to the second miracle. Because Jesus comes across the disciples who are rowing across the sea. Now, he could have carried on walking and left them to their rowing. He could have just walked past them and just said, all right, guys, keep up the good work. That's it. See you over there. He could have just carried on walking and left them to their rowing. So we see in this passage that Jesus is more than a teacher. He could perform miraculous signs, but he could also have been someone who just doesn't care. So he's got this amazing power to walk on water, but he doesn't care. He could be divine, the Messiah, the Son of God, a performer of miracles, but totally disinterested in the disciples or in us. As I said, the man who could walk on water could have just simply passed the disciples by and kept on walking. Alternately, he could have been a man of deep compassion, who cared deeply about the disciples, but was totally powerless to help. He could have been stranded on the shore, caring about them, but totally impotent. As part of the series, 2 weeks ago, Emma preached to us about the healing by the pool. The man who was stranded by this pool, the water gets stirred up and people are going to have healing, but he's left stranded there. And she made the point about Jesus having power and compassion. Power and compassion. That's what we see here, okay? Jesus has power. He can walk on water. Jesus has compassion. And in this case, he walks over to the boat where the disciples are. And when he goes to the boat where the disciples are, he does two things, okay? Number one, he reassures them. The disciples are there frantically trying to get to the other side, rowing through the middle of a storm. I know from experience, it's hard enough rowing when it's like a mill pond. When you're rowing when it's calm, what rowing in a storm must be like. You must be extending a lot of energy and not having a lot to show for it. But they're there, the disciples, manfully battling away in the middle of a storm. And when they see Jesus, they're terrified. So the first thing that Jesus did was to reassure them, to calm them down. And he says to them this, "It is I, do not be afraid." Okay, now as an aside, I've actually done some research on this, and apparently, according to the NIV, there are 70 occasions when either God, Jesus, or an angel issues the command, "Do not be afraid." We tend to think of the Bible as a big book of don'ts. You've got the 10 Commandments, you do not steal, do not lie, do not covet, etc. The most common command in the Bible by far is this: do not fear, do not be afraid. So Jesus goes to the disciples in the boat, and he tells them not to fear. He reassures them. He doesn't calm the sea, he calms the disciples. Then he gets into the boat. Now the key phrase here to note is, then they were willing to take him into the boat. Okay, the key phrase, they were willing. Jesus didn't just climb into the boat, he was invited. And it says immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. Now I see this as a miracle, mainly because of the use of the word immediately. John, the gospel writer, is adamant that's how it happened. It's not soon, it's not shortly, it's not in a little while, it's immediately. Jesus gets into the boat and immediately they're where they need to be. So that is the second miracle in our passage. And the statement I want to make here is this, is that Jesus meets us at our point of need. If we just have a look back at the series and what we've preached on so far and have a recap. Okay, so John Bennet preached, a host is frantic because a wedding has run out of wine, so Jesus turns water into wine. Steve Shenton preached about a desperate official pleading to Jesus to heal his son. The son is healed. Paralyzed man, as I said, Emma preached about the paralyzed man. Years of frustration meets Jesus, and he receives the healing he's longed for. A hungry crowd are fed. And in this passage, Jesus reassures 12 frantic disciples and gets them where they need to be. Now, when both John and Steve preached, they made this point that Jesus meets us at a point of need physically. Okay, so like I said, water is turned into wine, physical thing. There's the physical healing of the official's son. And here the disciples get to the shore. Jesus isn't just interested in our spiritual well-being, he's also interested in our physical well-being. He's interested in both. He's interested in both our physical and spiritual well-being. Now, we sung a song, Phil Wickham's song, This Is Amazing Grace, and we actually sang this just before John preached. I remember the first line of the song really spoke to me. You know, who breaks the power of sin and darkness? Jesus doesn't just have power over nature. He doesn't just have the power to walk on water. He has power over sin. Now, this is something spiritual. I believe whatever our physical needs are, and they will differ greatly, we do share the same spiritual need. We need someone to break the power of sin. Now, last week, when the young people at the service, they made this point. When Jesus meets our physical needs, such as feeding the 5,000, that is a wonderful blessing. But as we see in the feeding of the 5,000, that in itself is not enough. The 5,000 will have their fill, but even though there are 12 baskets of food left over, they will soon be hungry again. And the verse in which they shared with us last week, the memory verse, is this, John 6:35. Then Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. So Jesus offers himself as the bread of life. So we believe in Jesus Christ as the Messiah, someone who we have seen has the power and compassion, someone who meets our needs. He heals the sick, he feeds the hungry, and in today's passage he walks on water and helps the disciples who were struggling through a storm. But he also meets our needs spiritually. The 5,000 would again get hungry. The wedding feast would come to an end. The healed would eventually die. The disciples would again face struggles, but without Jesus being physically with them. But when Jesus meets our spiritual needs, that is forever. If we receive the bread of life, we will never go hungry. So the miracles of Jesus show that he is more than a good teacher. He has power and compassion. He can heal the sick. He can feed the hungry. He can walk on water. But he can do more than that. He breaks the power of sin and darkness, and that is forever. Amen.